Well, welcome, Bible Love listeners, back to this very special series that we are doing this summer called Women in Ministry. I'm so thrilled to be doing this. A little nervous. Don't have my co-anchor with me, Alan, but he's taught me how to do it. So here we are. And I'm so glad to introduce you to our first guest in the Women in Ministry series, the Right Reverend Ann Hodges-Copple. She is the Bishop Suffragan of the Diocese of North Carolina. At one time, she was my bishop when I served in the Diocese of North Carolina. She's always been a wonderful mentor and friend, and not her colleague, but someone that I could trust and share whatever I needed to share with. You always had such an open door policy for me, Bishop Ann. So I'm glad you're here. Before we start, I'm going to start us in prayer. And so this is the prayer attributed to St. Francis. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.
Amen.
Well, welcome, Bishop Ann. I'm so glad to see you after a few years.
I know. This is great. I feel like you're right here. Well, you are in my family room, just virtually.
Right. Just virtually. And you're in mine. I'm at my home today, too. So the first question I wanted to ask you, Bishop Ann, can you talk a little bit about what your title is of Bishop Suffragan? Just those that don't understand will understand that a little bit more. Do you mind?
Not at all. And let me just say again, how delighted I feel and honored and blessed to be with you. Because we just always have good conversations.
We do.
Great conversations. And I think so much about life in Christ is about that communication, being in communing by understanding and listening to somebody else. And I love to be with you. So this is great. So yeah, I don't get that question as often as I'd like, but I get it. And I certainly had to think about what that meant, because first of all, I never even thought about being a priest in the Episcopal Church, let alone becoming a bishop. So everything about who I am, where I am, it's just sort of like a big surprise party to me. So this word Bishop Suffragan. So here's the easiest thing to start off with. You know how we have suffrages in our daily office? Suffrages are these things that we're asking God, right? We're asking. Remember the suffragettes of old. We're asking women, and not just asking, petitioning, just dang short of demanding, but saying, here is what we need to the best of our discernment. Now a bishop diocesan who has certain canonical roles is the authority in certain canonical defined ways, but the canons are just laws. A bishop suffragan can go hire an assisting bishop, and that's a good and fine thing to do. But hires a retired bishop diocesan usually, right? Mm-hmm. When a convention meets and says, actually, we'd like to elect through prayer, through discernment, through searching, and ask the Holy Spirit to lead us in choosing. So a bishop suffragan is chosen. First convention grants permission for a search to happen for a suffragan. And then there's an election and then a consecration. So the easiest thing to say, if I can say it this way without it sounding too boastful, a bishop suffragan is the bishop you prayed for. And not that that's not true of a diocesan, but prayed, elected in the sense to be an extension of the authority of the bishop diocesan. So it is someone you asked for. Be careful what you pray for, because sometimes your bishop can be kind of troublemakers. And a bishop suffragan also has to pray and ask that the role and the call and the vocation is used to augment and to follow the episcopae of the diocesan. So I
Yeah.
share things. I share things with Bishop Sam. I share episcopae, but I also, I guess you could say, have tenure because
Mm-hmm.
then I can also say things like, by the way,
Right. I love that.
so there's
I love how you said that is the bishop you prayed for. I think that is such a beautiful
yeah.
thing. And you have served in a different role as bishop too, and we'll get to that in a minute. I want you to think back in your memory. You did not grow up Episcopalian, right? Is that correct?
Oh
Or did you?
yes, oh
You
yes,
did.
ma'am.
Okay, you grew up Episcopalian, but
Yeah.
you are a wife and a mother and a grandmother.
Yeah.
Tell us about that first calling that you felt to serve God in ministry in this way, not as a bishop, just as an ordained, not just as an ordained
Right,
person.
right, right. So, gosh, that's complicated, right? Because I did grow up in the church, and at the church I grew up in, Mary Balfour, only men
Right.
had roles, spoken roles in the liturgy. It was morning prayer with communion, first Sunday of the month. Only men could lay read, only men could be anything in the service, right? And because I sang in the junior choir at the 9 o'clock service, I could see everything that was happening.
Right.
That didn't seem wrong to me. That's what was normal, right?
Right.
As I grew up, and that lasted a long time. And
Mhm.
so, of course, when I saw women, they were either in the senior choir or they were altar guild, right? They had their hats on and they had smocks on, and
Mhm.
they had very defined ways that they could approach the altar. Didn't think, but which I think is interesting, right? They needed
Right.
to get all covered up, covered up
That's right.
before they
And
could get close to the holy
probably
things.
didn't speak very much either, did they,
Oh
Bishop
no,
Ann?
no. And so that was all normative and
Mhm.
very explicitly so. It was unapologetic. Men are called to these things, women are not. And for the longest time, I just kind of accepted that.
Mhm.
So by the time I started to question that, I'm more question in terms of well, what kind of church would do that, right? What kind of church? And I did kind of, so to me, it was like this huge surprise when one day I was at a church in another diocese and I saw the first woman priest I saw ever.
Wow.
And
And
I
you
wish I
remember that moment.
absolutely. And I think I was
Wow.
like 22 years old. And of course, things had started to change, but I had not experienced it. And there was just kind of this, what? And it was sort of
I
like the
bet.
scales falling off of your eyes. Like it'd been right in front of you, but you hadn't seen it.
Mhm.
Now, I did not feel called at that time, but it opened up a vista that I can use fancy words for now, of inclusion, of hospitality, but it just opened up possibility. And something about it felt so right. And I kind of want to fast forward and let me just say it's been interesting to be in that role other
Sure.
places. But early on, and I can go on and on about this stuff, Mayor Balfour, but let me tell you, early on, it was made very clear to me explicitly about all the reasons women shouldn't be priests, including
Sure.
that how horrible it would be. What if she was pregnant? Now, I know that's
Mhm.
going to fall on your listeners' ears kind of odd, but you don't understand. There was a time where you could not even put a very pregnant Virgin Mary on the cover of a diocesan newspaper. That was that was well, there was a time where once you were pregnant, you had to quit your job, right? Back in the 1950s. I mean, I
Mhm.
don't think we remember for how long the female body was something to exclude and hide,
Yeah.
but
And
never really explained why.
I recently was following this female priest on Instagram. She's a little bit younger than I am, and she just had a baby, and she was talking about clergy image, which, if you don't know who that is, listeners, that's a women's organization that helps put together clerical collars and investments and that kind of stuff for women. But she had just ordered the one that you could use for breastfeeding, and I thought, how far have we come that this is amazing that a woman can wear her clergy collar and still breastfeed her baby at the same moment, and there's no shame in that. and it
Right.
just warmed
Right.
my heart so much, you know.
Well, I vow for and I'm kind of skipping through some things, but I was ordained in 1987, and I did have one of those
Did
clergy
you?
shirts, and it was the first of all that, and let me
Yeah,
tell you, it was not easy to go to clergy conferences
I bet.
with your nursing child. Let me just put it that way. But it really took a while, and that's a longer story. It took a while for me to understand that I could be called as a woman. And part of the reason I was ordained in the Diocese of North Carolina is because I could go through, which was not my home diocese, I could go through that process without needing to defend the ordination of women. I
Wow.
could do my discernment, not an advocacy for an entire class of people. And so this diocese really helped me in the early 80s understand that I could hear a call, or
I
not,
didn't
that I was hearing a call, and I could enter into a trusted time of discernment. But
I
it
didn't
took a
know
while.
that about the Diocese of North Carolina. That makes me so proud. I'm so
Yeah,
glad to know that
yeah,
because
we
you
had ordained women by the early 80s.
that's great
And of
because you,
course,
as oh, I was just going to say, as you know, when I went through the process in 2008, 2009, and now this was in Alabama, but it was no big deal. You know, I mean, there was so many women that had gone before
right.
me, just like you. But it is there. But I do remember there being a couple of places that people saying, you know, I'm not sure if they're ready for a female priest to
Oh,
serve
yeah.
at their church, and I think that's probably still
Oh,
true
yeah.
today. You know.
Oh, yeah. I think
Um,
that's
okay, so you went to seminary. You felt that call. You didn't have to defend yourself at the time. You're married with children, without children.
so. I did not have my so when I was in the process, I came in one time about, let me think, about 6 months pregnant. It was getting close to the time of
Okay.
ordination. Bishop Estel said, "Well, why don't we ordain you in early June?" And I was very pregnant. I said, "Bishop
Uh,
Estel, that's when this baby's due. So
right.
why
That
don't
might
we
not
wait
work.
a few months? I've waited this long. Why don't
Yeah.
we wait a few months?" Um, but when I did start in my first role as an assistant to a rector at a parish church, I had a 3-month-old child,
So
and I
your
was
children have never known you not as an ordained
oh,
person.
that's right, that's right. And
How wonderful.
let me tell you a funny story. I have three. When the oldest was in middle school, he was starting to walk home by himself, which was a big deal, right? But I would
Yeah.
meet him. But he would walk home from his middle school, and then I would arrive uh, home from church because I would pick up the siblings and come home. And one day I came in the door, and there was something. He had a chore. He had a certain thing he needed to do, and I cannot tell you what it was. I don't know if it was let out the dog, or it was something that I felt a certain amount of urgency about that he had not done that particular day. And bad mom moment, I just lit into that child. I just lit into that child verbally. Like, blah, blah, blah. If I can't trust you to do this thing when I get home, I'm just going to have to quit. I'm just going to have to quit working. And that's poor boy. I think he was in sixth grade or seventh grade. Teared up, teared up. He said, Mom, you can't quit being a priest. You love being a priest. I love that you're a priest.
Oh.
Mom, you can't quit." And of course, that was cold water on my face. And I calmed down. I said, "Daniel, you are, you know what? Your mom is out of control. I'm sorry. I lost my temper. You are right. I am not gonna quit being a priest. And but well, why don't we both take a deep breath and then
Yeah.
talk about this situation more calmly?"
Well,
That's
I
how I
love
could pretend that I handled it. I'm not sure that's exactly how I handled it, but that's
Well,
how
but
I'm
I
gonna
love
remember
that
it.
story exactly, and I love that story because that's another thing I wanted to ask you about is
Yeah,
being a mother and a spouse and now a grandmother, you know, as an ordained person. That is not easy. You know, I've seen a lot of I mean, honestly, I've told you this before, Bishop Ann. I'm not sure I could do what I do if I had children. So I look to you and others who have done that. And that a lot of that's my own personality, but I look to you and others who have done that, and I'm very much in awe. You know, so tell me about some of the struggles and some of the goodness that
absolutely.
came out of that.
Absolutely. So, there's no one right way to do this, right? And there's no formula. There's just stories. There's lots and lots of stories. And I think that should be encouraging, because I think all parents put a lot of pressure on themselves, for sure. Clergy parents put a lot of pressure. I think clergy women put a lot of feel a lot of pressure from inside, from outside. We feel a lot of pressure, and I can't tell you how many times you answer that question. Well, how are you going to balance this? And the work life balance question is now more ubiquitous and not so gender specific. But I tell you, early on, it was very gender
Oh, yeah.
specific about, well, how are you going to do this? And so that was something to struggle with all the time. And I don't know that now that I'm a parent of adults and have children, you're never going to stop worrying about your children. You're just not. And you're never not going to wonder somewhere in the back of your head, is that my fault? And of course,
Hmm.
whatever bad thing has happened is your fault. And you kiddingly, half-heartedly tell your children, when they're younger, well, you'll just have to work that out with your therapist when you're grown. I mean, you're just not going to do this perfectly. Um, but I will say that as I moved through motherhood, and I've done this. You know how in your GPS you have a route, and you sometimes you kind of want to look ahead, but then you get that thing that says recenter, on your
Hmm.
GPS, and you're like, okay, well, let's get back to where we actually are, not where we think we're going. Let's get back to kind of where we actually are, what's immediate. And so there's a constant recentering as your family dynamics change. So you have to have some adaptability. And to me and my husband, John, if it wasn't working for the household, it wasn't going to work for anything else.
Mm.
So there was a centering. And I think even in the New Testament, right? Even in the first house churches, we have to keep remembering that we're not just adapting our lives to a corporate structure, right? But we are asking the world to help maintain the center we have on Christ at home, that then we build out into seeing Christ in the world, finding Christ in the wilderness. The church, in some ways, and is an extension, we welcome you into the household of God, right? Is what we say at the conclusion of baptism. So there is a calibration that I think John and I never got perfectly, but we were attentive to, about how's the family doing. So in our case, I did not work. I was ordained at 30, but I did not work full time as a rector till I was 47.
Mm.
Many of my colleagues, men and women, were working more hours than that and had loftier titles. And that's not really a kind way to put that, but they were doing these really big things, and I'm like, I can't do that yet. I can't do that yet. So for me, early on, the first, almost 2 decades, it really needed to, if it wasn't going to work for our household, whatever it was. Now, did I say I didn't work full time? I worked hard,
Oh, I'm
right?
sure
So
you did.
I
I'm
was in
sure you
parish
did.
ministry for years, and then I was in campus ministry for years, and I worked hard. I worked smart, but I worked in a calibration that I think gave our kids good things as we went along.
Well, and
Does that
so
mean
good
we
for
were
you.
scared? But go ahead.
Well, good
Yeah.
for you for like realizing. I know you worked hard, and I have no doubt about you that I've been around you enough, Bishop Ann, to know that your heart is so for the Lord and so for ministry. But good for you for being able to recognize it's not quite my time yet to do that. This is what I can do right now.
For
But
seasons.
boy, when it was your time, man, you became the rector of big church. You did that for many years, and then God called you to become a bishop. So tell me a little bit about
Right.
that.
So a little bit about that. No one could have been more surprised than I was and remain, because that is not something I'd ever seen in myself, aspired to. Um, but when Bishop Curry, as you know, was here and was talking to us in some language that's evolved about some missional work, when I read the portfolio for the call of a bishop suffragan, um, when I went through that portfolio, I was like, well, wait a second. Uh, Young adult ministry, global ministries, justice ministries. I kind of went through this and I went, but I do have some thoughts on these things. And some friends challenged me. They said, well, why wouldn't you at least be part of the conversation?
Mm-hmm.
And that shifted something in me. Rather than thinking like, do I want to be a bishop? do I want to be part of a conversation about these things? Because a process of discernment is, again, a rich conversation. So I
Sure.
kept waiting to be eliminated. I kid
Interesting.
you not. I kept kind of hoping, maybe that's not, I kept waiting in some ways, hoping to be eliminated. But as you can tell, I'm loquacious, but I was interested in those areas and I had ideas and I had thoughts.
Let me
So,
ask you this real
oh, yeah.
quick, Bishop Ann. Did you know any other women bishops at the time?
Okay, let me go back. Let me go back a second.
Or were
I
you friendly with
did
any other women
no,
bishops?
no, no, I didn't know, and the thing is, in fact, there were all kinds of, which I didn't know about, there were all kinds of programs that were kinda out there, kind of helping people hear th women think about this, hear that
Mm.
call, and I'm so glad they are, and they were. No, 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 no. Now, had I, we had had a couple of women be in some election processes in North
Mhm.
Carolina, had I advocated for bishops becoming women? Absolutely. Um, there's a funny story I can tell you later about Barbara Harris. So I knew of women who were bishops. I had championed that since the 80s, but nobody, there was, other than someone I did not know till after I was ordained, Susan Goff in Virginia, there were no women bishops in the South. There just
I
weren't.
know.
And I
And
didn't
so
get
that must
around.
have felt intimidating in some ways, but also very empowering too, I hope.
Yeah. Um, Intimidating. That depends on who you mean. Not much intimidates me, Mary
Well,
Balfour,
I know.
except God. And I
Right.
think the last thing I wanted to do, the only thing I've really wanted to do is to serve God. And
Yeah.
so it wasn't that I didn't think women should be bishops. It's just that I didn't need to be a bishop
I understand.
until I could feel and hear and believe that I needed to just at least have the vulnerability to be
I
in the
understand.
process.
Well, the reason I say that is because sometimes I think I don't see a lot, and it's getting better, but I don't see lot of other priests that look like me or act like me or talk
Yeah,
like me. And so and that's okay because I want the young women in my church to look up there every Sunday and be like, if God calls me to do that, I can do it too.
right, right, right.
But that's what I was kind of thinking. If you don't see other people in your area or that are like you, and I'm so
Mhm.
glad you and Bishop Goff got to be friends, but this could be scary. But I'm
Oh, yeah.
so glad you followed your heart, and good for the Diocese of North Carolina elected you to this position. Now, something changed a few years after you were
That's
elected to this position. Our beloved Bishop Curry is elected um, the presiding bishop. And so then you had to do something you probably weren't expecting, right? And
right.
step in as the provisional bishop of the Diocese of North Carolina, right? So what was that like?
So, and it was called Bishop pro tempore.
Oh, yes.
It's
Thank
a
you.
slight
Thank you for
distinction,
that.
and it's
Thank you
not a
for
big
that.
deal. It's just a slight distinction. So first of all, let me back up to the day of my consecration, which was at Duke Chapel, and it was wonderful.
Oh, I wish I could have been there, Bishop Ann.
Well,
I can
it is
imagine.
recorded, and the music was great
I'll
because
go
Duke
back and
Chapel is
watch it.
you can go to the Duke Chapel website, and the
I'll
music was
link
just
it to the show notes so
oh,
everybody
do.
can
Do,
see
do,
it.
do. But you sign a certificate right before, um, you're ordained. And as I mean, my pen was going to the paper when the secretary of the diocese, who was someone I knew, Joe Farrell, said, "Well, in North Carolina, according to our canons, the bishop suffragan may become the ecclesiastical authority." And I hadn't signed it. I'm like, "What?"
Oh, wow.
They're like, "Hey, why is he saying this?" And B, no, 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 no. They're like, the only thing I have signed up for is this one thing. And Miriam Alpha, I had to be the only idiot in the Episcopal Church that did not see the handwriting on the wall in 2013. I just
Mhm.
this job description had been written to go hand in hand with Bishop Curry, go to Galilee. We had this whole missional thing that I was 100% in on. So I was so then, by 14, the buzz, 20, a year into it, the buzz was on, and, you know, appeared, like, wow, this could happen. And I was, let's see, it's too complicated to go into all the details. I just was along for the ride. I'm like, Lord, this is all in your hands. This is so in your hands. And it was such a roller coaster of things, just his election, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then it started to sink in that there's this option where the standing committee can be the ecclesiastical authority or the bishop suffragan. So we had to have a conversation. That is where I did lean in. I'm like, hold on, I can do this. I, I can do this for a
And
couple of years. I
you
can
did
do
it
this.
very, very well.
Yeah, you were here then. You
That's
were
when
here.
my first conversation
Yeah,
with you when I was thinking about going to Southern Pines. We had a Zoom conversation. That's when I met you, and I thought, wow, they have a woman bishop. This is so cool.
right.
And the amount of times you supported me and the conversations. And I remember one time calling and saying I needed to visit with you, and your assistant said, sometimes you just need your bishop, right? And I said, yes, sometimes you do. And it was just wonderful. So thank you for going along on the ride and seeing
Yeah,
what happened.
yeah, yeah.
And so next you have announced and you educated me this morning, your resignation,
Right.
and a new chapter is upon you. Will you tell us a little bit about what
Yeah.
is next for you?
Sure. So the way I like to describe this, I have announced, in the secular world, you would call it retirement, but in the church world, when you have finished your certain time, or where you discern that it's time for a certain chapter to stop, you call that a resignation because you're a bishop for life in our part of the Christian family tree. So I am going to resign as the bishop suffragan of North Carolina. I will still be a bishop suffragan of North Carolina, parenthetical resigned. I feel a little bit like Mary Poppins. Like my health is good, my life is good, my vision is good. Well, actually, my vision is not that great, but my vision for the world is good. It's just time for this particular chapter to close. And a huge piece of that is that I have all my adult children have moved back to the area this now, and they all have partners who are wonderful. Who
Oh,
does that happen to?
wonderful. That's awesome.
And now there's two grandchildren, and I kind of have hopes there might be others, but if there's not, that's fine too. And they're all right here, and I have siblings nearby, and a fantastic husband. And it's again the GPS thing. I want to recenter now around my family because I know how hard it is as a young adult to raise children and just to navigate the world. And I think it's gotten even harder in some ways.
Mhm.
I'm worried about the post COVID world. Our kids all went to public schools. Our grandkids are going to go to public schools. What's there's so much that I'm a former community organizer. I'm a former shelter director for battered women. And my heart of hearts, I'm a local girl. I just so believe I'm watching we have an urban garden that we share with a bunch of neighbors. I'm watching a bunch of my neighbors out here gardening away. I need to recenter. I'm worried about a lot of things. People being able to vote. People, I want to go back to my core values, which have to do with Sifra and Pua, the Hebrew midwives, in that first chapter of Exodus. Right? They are the deliverers of the deliverer. Funny how that works. I'm very interested in getting back to sort of the grassroots ways of my baptismal call and doing that alongside families and neighbors and friends. I'm tired of telling my friends, I'm sorry, I can't. I'm sorry, I can't. I'm sorry, I
Right.
can't. I hear there's this thing called a weekend.
Yeah.
I hear there's this thing called a long weekend. So I just want
There's
to
this thing
recenter.
called a Sunday off where you don't
What, what
have to be somewhere on a Sunday.
I mean, I will always worship on a Sunday somewhere, maybe my camper, but yeah, so it's just a time because I've just turned 65. I've done that Medicare thing. It's like I cannot believe I'm this old. But I want to get ready for that. I want to really get ready for that. That's a big thing. The other thing is I want to make room at the table. I'm a baby boomer. I'm a woman in my 60s. We have a lot of that in the church. God love us. We work hard, but I'm a white baby boomer. I want to make some room at the table
Thank
for
you.
a different life experience, And that can be, I mean, wide open. It could be anything. Maybe it's another white, straight baby boomer. Seems like we have plenty of that at leadership tables. But I want to at least be a part of making room because there's so much great happening in this diocese. So much good stuff happening in this diocese. And I think it would be better as we implement our mission strategy to have a voice or more voices, depending on how things go, at some leadership tables who will be in active ministry for the next 15 and 20 years. So they are building and shaping and talking about informing the church we need to become, not quite so rooted in the church we've been. So I'm excited. It's like Mary Poppins. I'm putting up my umbrella. I'm gonna, and
Love
I'm
it.
doing all that without moving my house. I
I
don't
know,
have the
that's great.
decency to move.
I love it. It's wonderful. And I'm so excited about how God
Yeah.
is continuing to use you in your ministry. Bishop Ann, when I was thinking about this Women in Ministry podcast, you were one of the first people that popped into my mind. Thank you for your many years in ministry, all that you've done for the church and for God's people. For me personally, you have sat with me in times that I really needed you. And I know that you'll continue to do that if I need you. You will continue to
Absolutely.
be a bishop to all people. Thank you for starting our series off with us. Thank you for sharing your heart. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And listeners, remember, as always, we love you, but most importantly, God does.